Continental Commitment, The Nature of British Imperial Defence, 1900 to 1941. A 46-minute presentation sponsored by the Defence Studies Department held at the JSCSC Nelson Lecture Theatre at Shrivenham on the 11th of January 2006. The speaker is Professor Keith Nielsen, who is a member of the History Department of the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. He is a graduate of Cambridge University and is Canada's leading international historian. He was the head of the History Department at RMC from 1991 to 1994, and his main focus of research has been on Anglo-Russian strategic relations in the period 1880 to 1941, and in particular the concepts of imperial defence and strategic foreign policy creation. Professor Keith Nielsen.
It is important for people to realize that the past is something that is remembered in several senses of the word. As we have not directly experienced the events that occurred before our birth, our understanding of them is mediated by others. Now, this is not to suggest, and before people start running or hearing the words deconstruction and Derrida or something like that and run for the exits thinking that they've come to the wrong place, this is not to suggest that the past is either endlessly plastic, as literary theorists would have it, or an interpolated palimpsest, as Seller and Yateman once said about the Magna Carta. Instead, it is meant as a reminder that how we think about historical events is conditioned by the framework in which we place these occurrences. What they mean, and indeed what events are deemed worthy of being remembered and investigated, is determined by how we think about the past, our unspoken assumptions about it, and what questions we wish to investigate. This is nowhere more evident than when considering British defence policy. For most of us, our historical understanding of British defence policy is underpinned by two influential schools of thought. The first, dealing with things military, in the narrow sense of the word, derives from Sir Michael Howard's seminal work, The Continental Commitment, published in 1972. In it, Howard looks, as his subtitle, The Dilemmas for British Defence Policy in the Two World Wars suggest, at British defence policy from about 1900 to 1945. What he concludes is that, despite the fact that Britain had a large empire that needed to be defended, continental needs always and necessarily took precedence over extra-European affairs. Implied, too, was that this was always so, and that those who thought otherwise were living in a fool's paradise, and I shall return to that at the end of the lecture a little bit. The second school of thought deals with naval matters. It, too, is underpinned by several historical works of major importance, particularly Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of British Naval Mastery. While covering a much longer period of time than Howard's work, The Rise and Fall of Naval Mastery comes to similar conclusions when dealing with the period from 1900 to 1945. For Kennedy, this is a period when the focus of the Royal Navy was upon dealing with continental opponents, and the imperial role of the Royal Navy was necessarily subordinated to the need to cope with this menace. Germany is the golden thread upon which these two approaches are hung. Underpinning both is a belief that, as Britain fought two world wars, and of course one World Cup, but that's another matter, against Germany, then British defence planning must have always been, and indeed should have been, shaped by considerations of that country. For the Army, that means that the Continental Commitment takes centre stage both before 1914 and 1939. For the Royal Navy, that means that such matters as the Anglo-German naval race before 1914 and naval cutbacks before 1939 are the natural foci of investigation. These two schools of thought provide a compelling picture of British defence policy in the 20th century. First, it seemingly examines and explains the two major events, the World Wars and British defence policy. Second, it seems to be consonant with other givens, and I put that in inverted commas, about British history. The two most important of these for our purposes are the loss of empire and Britain's decline as a great power, indeed the end of the great power system after 1945. In both of these explanatory frameworks, the notion of imperial defence as opposed to continental responsibilities as a driving force in British military planning gives off a whiff, in the case of the loss of empire approach, of a decidedly archaic sort, and in the case of declinism, the thought of protecting empires, or clinging to empires as the phrase is always used, evokes a sense of knowing pity for anyone who thought in such terms. This, then, is the historical position. The point of today's lecture is to assert that such a position is both wrong and, in some ways even worse, misleading. The focus on the continental aspect of British defence planning has resulted in a thoroughly flawed misunderstanding of the past, or possibly a thoroughly flawed understanding of the past. In that sense, then, it is wrong and is bad history. However, were that the only result, it would matter only to historians and other irrelevant pedants. However, because history has presentist implications in that historical arguments are often used to justify present-day policy decisions, the fact that the German approach has become accepted wisdom means that it suffuses and informs contemporary defence policy. What the rest of this lecture done is to reconsider British defence policy in the same period that Howard and Kennedy looked at it. It will come to rather differing conclusions. First, I will show that considerations of Germany were rarely the most important factor in determining British defence policy at any time from 1900 to 1945. Second, I will show that, even during the two world wars, British policy, as opposed to actual military and naval endeavours, was not exclusively fixed on Germany. Third, and in a related fashion, I will show that British defence policy was truly imperial in this period. Fourth, I will suggest that British defence policy after 1945, or even after 1956 to adopt another historical signpost, did not cease to be imperial in nature, and that Soviet Russia, for example, did not take the place of Germany in the need for an ongoing British continental commitment after 1945. Let us first turn to the period before the First World War. In standard histories, this is portrayed as a period when the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia faced the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. When the July crisis triggered hostilities in 1914, so the textbooks tell us, the well-oiled war plans of the great powers ensured that the Third Balkan War became the First World War. For Britain, after some political shilly-shallying, the British Expeditionary Force was dispatched to France, and the inevitable and right and proper continental commitment had begun. This is wrong on a number of levels, and particularly wrong when considering the case of Britain. First, it is important to note that Britain was not obliged in any fashion to go to war in 1914. Neither the Entente Cordiale with France nor the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 had military provisions, even of a non-binding nature. Second, and in many ways a consequence of this fact, British war plans, in inverted commas, were completely different from their continental equivalents. There was no British Schlieffen Plan or even a Plan 17 or in any of its variants. Instead, as imperial historians have known for a long time, as opposed to military or diplomatic historians, for most of the 19th century, the defense of India was a major issue for those who dealt with British defense policy. And I will, of course, discuss this in a lot more detail when I talk about Russia in the next lecture. While the expected Russian descent on the northwest frontier did not occur, British military planners spent a good deal of time considering just how it would be opposed. And, in fact, when you look at actual combat in the 19th century, Britain's continental commitment after 1815 is vanishingly small. In fact, it is actually zero, unless one wishes to consider the Crimean War a continental commitment, which I do not. British military matters in the 19th century are, in fact, about fighting Queen Victoria's little wars. British methods of fighting, British equipment, and British doctrine, what there was of it, such as it was, all reflected this fact. With no continental commitment in sight, Britain could continue to prepare for wars of limited extra-European scale. There was no need for conscription, even if that option had been politically feasible, since imperial wars were not of the sort that involved mass armies that Napoleon had introduced to Europe. This is not to suggest, however, that the British military establishment was uninterested in European warfare. Indeed, as British military professionalism grew in the second half of the century under the impetus of the various reforms that were the military manifestation of what has been called the Victorian Revolution in government, the more progressive elements within the British Army kept a careful eye on continental advances. There was a sense for many of them that war between great powers was real war, and that imperial wars were in fact little more than glorified police work. However, always counterbalancing this was a body of opinion that opposed such thinking, that argued that Britain's imperial experience was in fact what set her army apart from its continental equivalents, that the lessons learned in such small wars, to use Charles Caldwell's term, were in themselves just as valuable as those that could be gleaned from the Austro-Prussian and Franco-Prussian conflicts. Just as Britain had a different and undoubtedly superior style of government and society from its continental neighbours, so too did it have a British way in warfare that was similarly superior. The duality in British military thinking, a discussion of which is at the heart of Howard's continental commitment, was compounded at the turn of the century. The Boer War laid bare all the weaknesses of the British Army and induced massive reforms, but these were not aimed at ensuring that a British expeditionary force could go to the continent, despite Haldane's later retrospective claims to the contrary. Instead, the reforms were designed simply to improve the British Army for whatever things it would be tasked to do, the most likely of which remained to defend India against Russian depredations. In fact, this latter concern was eased only by political considerations, the signing of the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, and was certainly was not replaced by any necessary commitment to the continent, despite the wishes of men like J.M. Grierson, the first director of military operations. In fact, of course, the fact that such a post had been created reflects the efforts to reform the British Army. The myth of the Continental Commitment before 1914 is usually based on the fact that, in the immediate aftermath of the signing of the Entente Cordiale in 1904, Germany attempted to split it by provoking the Moroccan crisis, something that was countered by the new Liberal Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, authorizing military talks with the French in the case that the diplomatic quarrel should lead to a clash of arms. However, this did not mean that the British were in any way committed to come to the aid of France. Grey made this very clear in a letter that he wrote to the British ambassador in Paris, Sir Francis Barty, on the 15th of January 1906. Diplomatic support we are pledged to give France, Grey averred, and we are giving. A promise in advance committing this country to take part in a continental war is another matter, and a very serious one. It is very difficult for any British government to give an engagement of this kind. It changes the Entente into an alliance, and alliances, especially continental alliances, are not in accordance with our traditions. It was in this context that Grierson and his successors as DMO, particularly Brigadier General Sir Henry Wilson, who's the last DMO before the war, continued to press their plans for continental commitment. Wilson in particular was a fervent advocate of such a course, an ardent Francophile and intriguer. Perhaps they go together, I'm not sure. The Ulsterman was perhaps the key individual of the General Staff who pushed for cooperation with the French in a continental commitment. In 1906, 1907, and 1908, the British, in conjunction with the French General Staff, worked out details of plans to send the BEF to the continent to deal with the German menace. And in October 1908, the CID established a subcommittee to consider Britain's defense responsibilities beyond securing the Empire. This subcommittee has as its chairman the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith. At the subcommittee, the General Staff put forward plans to send a BEF consisting of 4 divisions to the continent. This provoked heated opposition from the Royal Navy, which had its own vague plans for limited amphibious operations against Germany, and argued that Britain's contribution to any continental war would and should be maritime. The strategic differences were not resolved. Instead, a compromise was reached in which the form of the British contribution would take was left to be decided at the time, which left the Army and the Navy to pursue their own courses, their disparate paths, without taking into consideration each other's plans at all. Such an approach was acceptable only when the international situation was not threatening. This came to an end in 1911, when Germany precipitated the Second Moroccan crisis. The result was that the British had to decide upon a possible course of action, and this took place at the meeting of the CID on the 23rd of August 1911. For many historians, this meeting has taken on mythic proportions, marking the time at which the General Staff strategy of a continental commitment became accepted British policy. However, if the meeting is considered, and without this prejudice, this is true only in a very narrow sense. The purpose of the gathering was to determine, in Asquith's words, how Britain might, if required, give armed support to the French. First the Army and then the Navy outlined their proposals. The exposition put forward by Wilson and Field Marshal Sir William Nicholson, the CIGS, was nearly that of 1908. A British expeditionary force of 6 divisions and a cavalry division should be sent to France. For the General Staff, the role of the Royal Navy in the immediate crisis was to ferry the BEF to France and to guard against any possible invasion. None of this cut much ice with the Admiralty. That body had its own plans for dealing with the German menace. The essence of it was to blockade the whole of the German North Sea coast, this to be combined with a series of raids on the North Sea coast. These plans were met with intense criticism. The technical dangers of operating a fleet close to shore and any amphibious or coast blockade actions were stressed, as were the advantages accruing to shore-based artillery over naval artillery. There are many more things, including the ability of the Germans to move troops more quickly to reinforce via railways than the Royal Navy could move things by sea. What emerged clearly from the meeting was that the Admiralty simply opposed sending any BEF to the continent. The weakness of the Royal Navy's arguments were evident at the time, and have led historians to conclude that, as a result, the Army's plans were adopted as policy. In the words of one recent commentator, the egregious Neil Ferguson, the meeting had set the course for a military confrontation between France and Germany. Nothing, in fact, could be further from the truth. When Lord Esher, that eminence grise of British defence politics before the First World War, argued that very point to Asquith in October 1911, just after the meeting, the Prime Minister told Esher that he thought it, quote, impossible that this would occur. How this would astound the General Staff, Esher noted in his journal. This makes it clear just how tentative was the General Staff's victory in 1911, and underlines another significant point, the political opposition to any such war plan. The result of the 1911 CID meeting was, in fact, a full-fledged cabinet revolt against Grey. The Foreign Secretary, while he did not repudiate what he had done, told the cabinet that Britain was in no way obliged to support France, and I quote him again, "At no step of our intercourse with France since January 1906 had we either by diplomatic or military engagements compromised our freedom of decision and action in the event of war between France and Germany." That's from Asquith's report to the King of the cabinet meeting. And was forced to promise his colleagues, Grey was, that he would not hold any further talks with any country that could be construed as promising any British support. To mollify his colleagues and to demonstrate his even-handedness, Grey authorized the Haldane mission to Germany in 1912, one designed to see whether any kind of warming could take place in Anglo-German relations. It was a failure, but the fact remained, Britain was certainly not committed exclusively either to the Triple Entente or to any intervention on the continent. With this understood, it's time to return to the Royal Navy. The traditional view of pre-1914 naval strategy was established by Arthur Martyr, who, in keeping with the existing views of British foreign policy, argued that Sir John Fisher introduced a naval revolution by building a dreadnought and concentrating the Royal Navy in home waters to deal with a German menace. Paul Kennedy moved in Martyr's wake. Both the rise and fall of British naval mastery and more broadly in his rise and fall of the Anglo-German antagonism, Kennedy emphasized these points as well. However, this view has been undermined in the past 20 years. Although reading standard accounts of foreign policy as opposed to naval policy, you would never know this. It has been shown that Fisher's motivation for concentrating the fleet were financial, not strategic, that the introduction of the dreadnought was part of this scheme, and that Fisher in fact preferred battle cruisers to dreadnoughts. In fact, what Fisher intended to do was to use submarines and mines to create a flexible system of what he called flotilla defense for narrow waters, and to employ squadrons of battle cruisers deployed at key stations worldwide to ensure that British commerce was safe from attack and to deny the seas to London's enemies. Combined with this was a tactic of plunges, taking advantage of Britain's sophisticated naval industrial complex to introduce new technologies that would ensure that the Royal Navy's opponents were always one expensive research and development step behind their British counterpart. All of this was tied together by a sophisticated command and control system based on Britain's global cable system and emerging wireless capabilities that would allow the battle cruisers to be directed wherever they were needed and to keep the German fleet penned in narrow waters by submarines and torpedoes. When, in the aftermath of the Admiralty's weak showing at the CID meeting, Winston Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty, these ideas were never far from his mind, particularly as Fisher, even from retirement, ensured that this was so. However, there was opposition to these radical concepts within the Admiralty itself. Battenberg, Prince Louis of Battenberg, who became First Sea Lord in 1912, and Sir John Jellicoe, the second in command of the Home Fleet, favored a mixed approach of capital ships and submarines over Fisher's exclusive reliance on new technologies. However, in 1912, Churchill was willing to take the bull by the, in 1914 rather, Churchill was willing to take the bull by the horns and divert monies from the construction of battleships to the building of submarines and auxiliary craft necessary to put Fisher's vision into effect. Thus, the outbreak of the First World War found the Royal Navy at the beginning of a transformation as to how it would achieve its strategic goal of establishing command of the sea. The essential significance of this revolution in naval strategy for the matter under consideration here today is that it, far more than the plans that the Royal Navy had put forward on the 23rd of August, reflected the real war plans of the Royal Navy. These were global and imperial in nature and could have been adjusted to apply to France or Russia or the United States as easily as Germany. And perhaps more importantly, they all required no continental commitment, no sending of the BEF to France. The debates between the 5th and 12th of August of 1914 underline how tenuous was the continental commitment. Kitchener, the new Secretary of State for War, wanted to send only a token force to France and to retain the bulk of the force in Britain to guard against invasion and to ensure the security of Ireland and, in fact, to act as a reserve force to be deployed later at a point chosen by Britain rather than by France. Even the man who was to command the British Expeditionary Force, Sir John French, wanted to send the BEF to Antwerp rather than to Maubeuge, where the French would prefer. While the BEF was eventually dispatched as pre-war planning suggested, mostly due to French pleading and logistics, it consisted of a smaller force than had been envisioned in 1911, and of course it also came much later than was the case. This was not the workings of a predetermined continental commitment, nor of any kind of set war plan. Rather, it was, just as Britain's entry into the war itself had been, a largely ad hoc plan. And, as we shall see, it did not mark the beginning of a necessarily whole-scale commitment to the continent. The differences in naval plans that we've talked about were decided by events. The German unwillingness to seek battle meant that the all-out naval war in the North Sea did not occur. Instead, the Royal Navy initiated its, what you could call its information war against the German maritime strength, both in its commercial and naval aspects. Utilizing the Naval Intelligence Department's trade division's extensive data collected worldwide and communicated to a war room in London, the Royal Navy was able to maintain a close eye on German ship movements. Despite some initial setbacks, by the end of 1914, the Admiralty, with the invaluable assistance of the Foreign Office, whose blockade department was the nerve center and essential component in all this, was able to achieve an effective blockade, although of course it was never technically a blockade, and to clear the world trade routes of German commerce raiders. Neutrals were either co-opted or bullied as appropriate. Der Tag would have to wait to 1916 and Jutland. British maritime supremacy added yet another dimension to Britain's participation in the war. When Kitchener's armies were being formed, much debate ensued as to how best and where to employ them. Those who favored a continental commitment, that is, to send the troops to France as soon as possible, did not have their own way. There were those who advocated that Britain should largely concentrate in the maritime aspects of the war, maintaining command of the sea and act as the financier and armorer, two things that required seaborne trade, of the continental allies in a fashion more keeping with Britain's efforts, say, in the Napoleonic Wars or the 7 Years' War. For them, Britain's military forces should be kept to a limited number and employed in amphibious actions. See, for example, the ideas behind the Dardanelles or the Mesopotamian campaign. Nor were Britain's imperial interests, to the chagrin of such people as the Continentalist Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir William Robertson, forgotten in the war. The fact that the war spread beyond the outlines of Europe to encompass the sprawling lands of the Ottoman Empire meant that British forces were deployed in the Middle East, on the northwest frontiers, and at Salonika. Nor was Britain's commitment to the continent, even after the Somme, ever absolute. In the dark days of 1917, after the defection of Russia made it evident that a compromise peace might have to be reached, there were many voices who argued for a limited commitment of further British forces to the continent. Those who argued in this way had a number of strands to their position. They favored keeping as many men at Britain as required for the latter's economic and financial position to be maintained, upon which the survival of the Entente itself was based. For them, this, along with the long-term impact of the blockade and a possible influx of American soldiers, would be the path to victory, or at least the way to ensure that anything less was not injurious to British interests. For some, like Lord Curzon, it was thought most important that Britain's post-war imperial possessions should be assured above all else if a draw seemed likely in the main conflict. Thus, any continental commitment was to keeping France and Italy afloat and ensuring that there was no comprehensive German victory, rather than to maintaining any kind of massive British army in the field. Thus, I would contend that Britain's apparent continental commitment during the First World War was at best only sporadic and temporary. Only during 1916 can it be argued that it was wholehearted, and even then, I think this isn't a completely convincing argument. Due to her traditions in naval strength, Britain's war effort had many aspects that were denied to the other belligerents. While a large army was sent to the continent and maintained there, this did not mean that a continental commitment was preordained and inevitable, nor was it complete and unvarying even when it did go. The interwar period reflected the ephemeral nature of any supposed continental commitment for Britain, as British defence policy quickly reverted to the imperial. At the end of the war, Britain still had troops in France, of course, but was trying to remove them as quickly as possible. But she had troops spread throughout the empire and in areas which might become empire, in Ireland, the Middle East, and scattered bits of the Caucasus. In addition, there were troops in various parts of Russia. By 1923, most of this imperial overstretch had vanished. With a political settlement reached in Ireland, the intervention ended in Russia, and the Caucasus left to fend for themselves. This left the British Army with little to do but police the empire. The fact that this task was limited was fortunate. For this period it was one of limited budgets, and the Army found itself the Cinderella service, lacking any continental rationale for increased funding, and competing with a glamorous newcomer, the Royal Air Force, that contended that it could do many of the Army's imperial tasks more cheaply and with a lessened possibility of any loss of life. The one call that the Army could make on funds was a traditional imperial task, defending the northwest frontier from a new Russian Bolshevist descent. This threatened to become real, or at least the Army could make an argument that it could become real. In 1926, when a quarrel between Afghanistan and Soviet Russia over an island in the Oxus seemed likely to escalate into armed conflict. The Army maintained that any Russian advance into Afghanistan or Persia would be a casus belli, something that the Chiefs of Staff accepted, but adroit diplomacy prevented any escalation of the conflict, and the defense of India was left to the Indian Army and diplomacy. Far more effort, however, was expended in the Middle East to ensure that the security of the Suez Canal, that jugular of empire, remained safe. But once an agreed-upon border between Iraq and Turkey was established, this meant more imperial policing became the default position for the Army. The main focus of British defence policy, in fact, remained naval. Here the imperial aspect was obvious. There were no hostile European fleets. Instead, the Admiralty faced two enemies: the Treasury, with its desire to trim budgets, backed by the moral authority of a widespread desire for arms control, and Imperial Japan. The need to be able to meet any threat from Japan clearly underlined the imperial nature of Britain's global position. Japan posed no threat to Britain itself in any direct way. Japan was unable to threaten to invade Britain in the fashion of pre-1914 Germany. However, a powerful Japanese fleet operating from home bases could prey upon British commerce in the Far East and threaten imperial lines of communication with the Antipodes. This would have wide-ranging implications. Britain's position as a great power rested on her trading position and her ability to tap into worldwide resources while denying them to others. If there had been a single lesson provided by the First World War, surely that was it. It had not been Britain's continental commitment, however ephemeral and limited that I have argued about that it was, that had proved decisive in the conflict. Instead, it was Britain's maritime strength that had allowed her to act as the keystone that had kept the Allies together and capable of functioning, that had provided the edge against the Central Powers. Until the early 1930s, much of the discussion about British defence policy lacked any real intensity. This was due to the relatively benign nature of the international situation. In such circumstances, Britain's position could be maintained by what is nowadays referred to as soft power: moral suasion, leadership of the League, appeals to liberal internationalist norms, and the like. However, with the rise of the revisionist powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, once more hard power, the traditional accoutrements of great power strength, became a necessity. The symbol of this change was the calling of the Defence Requirements Subcommittee in 1933. Like the 23rd of August meeting of the CID, the deliberations of the DRC have been accorded iconic status amongst historians. It was here, the argument goes, that Germany, once more the villain of the peace, was declared Britain's ultimate enemy, and the need for a continental commitment was once more reaffirmed. The only difference between 1911 and 1933 is that at the latter time, the RAF emerged as the symbol of Britain's continental commitment, reflecting Bolden's famous remark that the bomber will always get through. However, as I have argued elsewhere at some length about the DRC, this was not really the case. Instead, what the DRC did, despite efforts by Neville Chamberlain to change its emphases, was to confirm that imperial defense, in the shape of preparing to deal with the threat posed by Japan, was the first priority of improvements that needed to be made to Britain's defense capabilities. Any continental commitment was shunned. Chamberlain, in fact, believed that a continental war could be avoided by creating an RAF that would act as a deterrent force so potent that a BEF would never have to leave Britain's shores. It was not until just before the outbreak of war that it was finally decided that a BEF would go to France, and there was certainly never any decision that this meant that the BEF was thought to be what would win the war for Britain should one actually occur. In fact, what the BEF was conceived to be was to act as a surety to France to ensure that Paris remained willing to defend itself. Victory was to be achieved in the same way that it was believed it had been achieved in the First World War, by the long-term effects of economic blockade. While this was going on, the Royal Navy would ensure that Britain maintained command of the seas and Britain's imperial position would be guaranteed as required. Events made this preferred approach the only approach. The collapse of France meant that any idea of a continental commitment was impossible. Britain's only weapon now was the blockade, as the glittering promises of the RAF proved false. Instead of being able to deter war by threatening any opponent with instant annihilation, the RAF proved itself just capable of preventing a similar fate from being inflicted on Britain. As to empire, Italy's entry into the war had a twofold impact. For the army, it proved an imperial field of endeavor in North Africa, a sort of geographically more distant and extensive version of the Peninsular War. It was a continental commitment, of course, but on a different continent. For the Navy, Italy's belligerency meant that all the concerns about imperial defense against Japan in the Far East were made more strong. In fact, it had been tacitly admitted much earlier that Britain was incapable of defending the Far East by herself. Instead, she had to rely on the efforts of China, supported by Soviet Russia, and the threat of American power to contain Tokyo. The course of the Second World War never saw Britain make an unalloyed continental commitment. The Italian campaign was more an extension of the imperial campaign against Italy than a descent upon Europe. The quarrels with the Americans over the Mediterranean strategy, and to some extent with the Soviets over the latter's demand for a second front in Europe, were at the bottom a quarrel between an unequivocal continental commitment and an imperial approach to war. Even after D-Day, the war in the Far East was never abandoned, nor was Italy. British policy remained imperial rather than continental until the end of the war. I would also like to suggest that this did not change after the Second World War. While Soviet Russia quickly came to occupy a position on the continent that was analogous to the threat that Germany had posed both in 1914 and 1939, and while Britain maintained its first peacetime force on the continent, this did not mean that Britain had finally seen the wisdom of and the necessity for a continental commitment. Instead, British defense policy remained firmly imperial. British forces were deployed around the world in the Middle East, in Africa, and the Far East, most famously in Malaya and later in Korea. The continental commitment was as much a political commitment as it was a defense commitment, a commitment designed to secure the alliance with the Americans and to assert Britain's position in the increasingly new bipolar world. Nor did British defense policy change as radically as some have asserted in the aftermath of Suez. British defense policy shows, as many in the audience know more than I do, a tenacious clinging to its imperial nature, at least until the early 1970s. Despite ICBMs, MAD, and the verities of the Cold War, British troops in the Royal Navy were performing tasks in Africa and Southeast Asia, not all that different from those that they had undertaken a century earlier. Let me conclude with two observations. The first is that I hope this lecture has made clear the fact that the orthodox version of British defense policy needs to be rethought. This is something that should make all who are interested in writing the history of British defense policy for the last 150 years or so reflect more on the imperial nature of Britain. This need to think more about empire, or again about empire, is already evident amongst imperial historians, a breed once nearing extinction, who are experiencing a significant revival. They have, after a long period of time when the metropole was written out of imperial history in favor of studies of the periphery, discovered that the empire makes little sense without Britain. For them, the empire has truly struck back. So it should too when we write about Britain's military past. For only when empire is considered, indeed placed in a central position, can we truly appreciate the true nature of British defense policy. My second observation refers more to the present. It seems to me that the historical study of imperial defense has a particular relevance for today's defense environment. The end of the Cold War has meant the demise of any need for the modern-day equivalent of the Continental Commitment, both for Britain and her allies, particularly, of course, for the United States. Much of what is taking place in the New World Order, a time of fluid politics, ideological tension, and clashes of civilizations, was prefigured in the British Imperial experience. Perhaps it is time that this imperial historical experience was rediscovered. Thank you.
Professor Nielsen was asked the following 5 questions. Question 1. How committed is Britain to continental commitment?
Well, I think that's a very good point, and I think it's absolutely fair. The idea of committing a democracy in advance to do something is a very difficult political issue, which of course is the point that was always made by every foreign secretary. Now, some of course thought that this was simply a way to dodge out of responsibility, and it was certainly none of the foreign secretaries were above using it in that exact sense. But in another way, I think it reflects the differing nature of Britain's position in the world in the period that we're talking about. It wasn't threatened by anyone, therefore it didn't need to commit itself. And this problem, I think, is not just a British problem. Writ large, this is the American position all the time. They are not threatened directly by anybody, therefore they will retain their flexibility. Now this, of course, I think is valuable in a number of ways. Countries that are directly concerned about their defense position, say France in 1914 or again in 1939, of course require these kinds of instantaneous responses. But I don't believe that a country that doesn't have these should necessarily take them on board. Because if you do, then you cut out any kind of last-second bargaining, last-second discussion, and the like. What I think you need to have beforehand is discussions of what we will do should we come in, so that lines of communication, lines of responsibility, joint structures, all of those sorts of things that NATO did so well are in place, so that when the balloon goes up, or if the balloon goes up, then you will be able to step in. But the idea that a country will commit itself to do something that's not in its own interest is, of course, a farce. Nobody ever does. And even if look at Italy in 1914. Italy dodges out from under its responsibility in the Triple Alliance on a technicality which everyone realized at the time. The Italians even called it was the policy of sacro egoismo. We'll do what suits us and what's good for us when it suits us. So, what can you tell the French? Remember who came and helped you in 1914 and who came and helped you in 1939. Would you rather rely on the word of a neighbor who has always helped you, or on somebody else, over this French desire to nail things down? It's too Descartesian for me. And I don't think it suits the British polity very much.
Question 2. Suez demonstrated that as far as Britain was concerned, the United States was more important for safeguarding Britain's interests than France was. Would you say this influenced decision-making?
Well, not only that, but of course, the United States had the levers to threaten the British more effectively than anyone else, and they certainly did. So they bowed to force majeure, as everyone does when it's not something that's absolutely central to their own policy that's involved. The United States is more important than Suez. Thus, they did what they had to do. In the same way, of course, one can always ask the French why they surrendered in 1940 instead of fighting on. If you need to do this, or why there were only 50 Gestapo men in France in the entire period of the occupation. The French were only too willing to help out in that sense. So I don't really think the French have much room to talk about perfidious Albion if we're going to look at historical things.
Question 3. There are strong arguments to suggest that the imperial side of Britain's interests is in decline, whereas the European and Atlantic side are moving up. Do you think it's time that Britain accepted that the imperial side is over and threw her hat into one of the other two camps?
No, I don't. It seems to me that unless Britain wants to become just merely a cog in an EU system, which will immediately change defense priorities to those of the continent and assume that those are her own. It seems to me much more likely that Britain's going to be involved in things either through the American connection or through the United Nations, through peacekeeping or peacemaking, which is the direction that many want to push the United Nations, in small wars of the sort that are almost indistinguishable, once you adjust for technology and the like, from the kinds of wars that Britain's own imperial past is full of. And I believe that Britain's experience in the 19th century up until even, say, 1956 or even a little bit later in that period is the best place to look for historical analogies. How to use limited amounts of force to achieve political goals. One of the problems you see in Iraq is that the United States has brought in large amounts of force to achieve a political goal and has proved absolutely ineffective, as the ongoing problems with the occupation have shown. Are there better ways to do these sorts of things? Could we not look at, say, how Britain handled Iraq in 1922 and say that's a much better way of doing it? And I think that to do that, to look at this from a historical perspective would be very useful, to give British defense planners a model from their own past that perhaps suits their own capabilities more than does any other kind of commitment. Now, I don't know whether this is true. I mean, perhaps I'm naive here, but I think that Britain can maintain an independent position, walking a fine line between Europe and the United States, or indeed just following its own interests, much better than it could if it were to join in with the EU. The interests of the EU are continental, as they always have been. What possible military threats are there to the EU come from the south? I'm thinking that Britain should give itself as much leeway as possible. If you're going to do UN interventions, then this requires imperial kinds of ideas. Imperial policing, imperial methods, which perhaps less force, more thinking in all of this. It's also much cheaper in a variety of ways. But you want a flexibility that being tied to somebody else's apron strings are going to take away from you. So I don't know, but I think it's some thoughts, and I think that looking at Britain's imperial past is actually very useful would be very useful for the Americans. I think it's the best model to look at. You don't have the verities of 1945 to 1991 anymore. You have a much more fluid situation, and I think that you cannot separate politics and military policy in any real sense. The changed political world means this. Now, what about Europe? What exactly would be tying yourself to Europe do for Britain? It would give it a greater body, but would it give it a greater voice? I'm not sure. I always have a suspicion of being tied to Europe, but I'm a foreigner, so it makes no difference to me.
Question 4. Couldn't you argue there is always a continental commitment for Britain to ensure that the continent is not governed by one European power, and that this is an unalienable continental commitment that must be met for the empire to work? And the second point is, doesn't Britain already have a continental commitment to India, which is so costly we can't afford another commitment to Europe?
Well, absolutely, Greg. I agree with both of your points, except that I think that there's the same answer to both of them. The continental commitment to Europe is to yourself, and it's somebody else is going to do the fighting, and you aren't. You'll contribute money, fight to the last Frenchman, fight to the last Russian, whatever. You'll provide money and supplies to everybody, and they'll do the fighting. The exact reverse is true in India. India can pay for it as well, and they can provide the men. You'll just provide a stiffening of white regulars to sort of maintain the proper tone in the Indian army.
Question 5. Isn't it true that during the Boer War there was a worry that there weren't enough people in Britain to send down there, and they were so overstretched in India that they were worried about bringing back too many regiments from there?
I think that the real crisis in British defence policy is the Boer War. Because the Boer War has that terrible thing. You can't get somebody else to do the fighting, and you have to pay for it yourself. It's a terrible war from that perspective. And that's why we just have to avoid one of those at all costs. Terrible thing. And that's I think, one of the reasons why the talks about burden sharing, as it were. That's why we get the Anglo-Japanese alliance in many ways. It's an expensive business, so why not farm some of it out in a local, temporary and local, restricted fashion to the Japanese to do it for you. But by God, you'll never take on an obligation to defend the French against the Germans, or indeed to defend the Germans against the Russians, which was at the heart of all the discussions with the Germans, was that you'd stay out of the war or else help them in any continental war. That's why the alliance talks with the Germans from 1899 to 1903, and the sporadic attempts by the Germans from about 1909 to 1912 all collapse. The Germans want you to stay out of a continental war. The British assumption is that's because you then think you can win this, and then we'd face you dominating the continent, which isn't to our advantage either. Or else you want us to help you against the Russians. And our problems with the Russians we've solved with by making a political agreement with them. So that's a much better arrangement from a British perspective. And I never expect countries to do anything that isn't good for them. They are the ultimate in sort of what's in it for me. Whenever it is a fit of altruism or, is passed off as a fit of altruism, of course, it's always at bottom. The general good tends to coincide with your own good, strangely enough. But it does provide a lovely bit of justification for the home market when you need to do these things.
Professor Nielsen can be contacted by email at Nielsen, that's Neilson, -K @rmc.ca.